The cards fell silent. $1 billion. Gone. At the Bellagio's most exclusive blackjack table, Richard Sterling watched his empire crumble with each flip of the dealer's hand. His pharmaceutical company, generations in the making, now hung by a thread. But sometimes, the smallest voices carry the biggest solutions. When a 12-year-old girl stepped forward with an idea that would change everything, she proved that wisdom doesn't always come with age. In the world of high-stakes gambling, where fortunes are won and lost in seconds, one family discovered that their greatest asset wasn't money, it was each other. This is the story of how losing everything led to finding what truly mattered. A story of redemption, trust, and the courage to bet on hope when all seems lost. The Sterling Gamble, a story of risk, redemption, and family. The neon lights of the Bellagio cast their eternal glow across the Las Vegas Strip as Richard Sterling approached the high-limit blackjack room. At 62, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his Italian suit immaculate, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built a pharmaceutical empire from nothing. But tonight, that confidence masked a desperation that gnawed at his very core. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling," the dealer, Maria Santos, greeted him with a professional smile. She had been working this table for 15 years, long enough to recognize the look in his eyes, the same look she'd seen in countless faces before they made decisions that would haunt them forever. Richard nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wallet. "Maria, let's keep this between us tonight." The minimum bet at this table was $50,000. Richard placed his first chips, 100,000, and the game began. What Maria didn't know, what no one in that glittering palace of chance could have imagined, was that Richard Sterling was about to lose everything his family had built over 3 generations. Hours earlier, in the stark conference room of Sterling Pharmaceuticals headquarters in San Francisco, Richard had received the news that would drive him to this moment of madness. The FDA had rejected their miracle drug for Alzheimer's disease, the medication that was supposed to secure their family's legacy for generations to come. 20 years of research, $300 million in development costs, and the hopes of millions of families affected by the disease, all reduced to a single word: denied. "The board is calling for an emergency meeting," his assistant had whispered, her voice barely audible. "The stock price has dropped 60% in pre-market trading." But Richard Sterling was a gambler at heart, a trait that had served him well in the cutthroat world of pharmaceutical development, but now threatened to destroy everything he held dear. Instead of facing his board, instead of confronting the reality of potential bankruptcy, he had boarded his private jet to Las Vegas with a single, desperate plan: to win back everything in one night. "Hit me," Richard said, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. The cards came fast, too fast. Maria's experienced hands dealt with mechanical precision, while Richard's bets grew larger with each losing hand. 100,000 became 500,000. 500,000 became 2 million. "Sir," Maria said quietly during a brief pause in the action, "perhaps you'd like to take a break, get some fresh air." Richard looked at her then, really looked at her. Maria was in her 50s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a life lived honestly. There was genuine concern in her voice, the kind of human compassion that was rare in a place built on human weakness. "I appreciate your concern, Maria, but I'm fine. This is just a temporary setback." He placed another stack of chips on the table. $5 million this time. "I've been in worse situations." But as the night wore on, as the numbers on his chips dwindled and the weight of his losses grew heavier, Richard realized that this was no longer about the money. This was about proving to himself that he was still the man who had built Sterling Pharmaceuticals from a single laboratory into a global powerhouse. This was about refusing to accept defeat, even when defeat was staring him in the face with the cold certainty of mathematical probability. By 3 in the morning, Richard Sterling had lost $800 million. The high-limit room had grown quiet except for the soft whisper of cards and the gentle click of chips. Even the other high rollers had stopped their own games to watch this man's systematic destruction of generational wealth. "Mr. Sterling," Maria said, her professional composure finally cracking, "please, think about your family." For a moment, Richard's hand froze over his remaining chips. His family. His daughter Sarah, who worked tirelessly as the company's research director. His son Michael, who had just graduated from Harvard Business School and was eager to prove himself in the family business. And his granddaughter, Emma, brilliant, precocious Emma, who, at 12 years old, could already calculate complex mathematical equations in her head and dreamed of becoming a scientist like her grandfather. But the moment of clarity passed, swept away by the intoxicating possibility of redemption through one perfect hand. Deal the cards, Maria. The final hand was almost anticlimactic. Richard bet his last $200 million, everything that remained of his liquid assets. Everything that stood between his family's company and bankruptcy. He drew to 21, a perfect blackjack that should have been his salvation. But Maria's cards revealed something that occurred less than 5% of the time in professional blackjack. The dealer also had 21, a push, a tie. In any other circumstance, it would have meant keeping his money. But the house rules at this level were different, more complex. With the side bets he had placed, with the insurance he had bought, with all the small decisions that had seemed insignificant in the heat of the moment, the push became a loss. $1 billion. Gone. Richard Sterling sat in stunned silence as the reality crashed over him like a tidal wave. The pharmaceutical company that bore his name, the research laboratories where breakthrough medications were developed, the jobs of thousands of employees who depended on Sterling Pharmaceuticals for their livelihoods, of it was now in jeopardy because of his catastrophic decision. "I need to make a phone call," he whispered to Maria, who nodded with the kind of professional discretion that had kept her employed in this unforgiving environment for so long. The call to his daughter Sarah was the hardest conversation of Richard Sterling's life. It was 6 in the morning in San Francisco when her phone rang, pulling her from a restless sleep that had been haunted by nightmares about the company's uncertain future. "Dad, what's wrong? You sound terrible." Richard closed his eyes, standing alone in the Bellagio's marble bathroom. The sound of distant slot machines, providing a surreal soundtrack to his confession. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I've made a mistake, a terrible mistake." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for what felt like an eternity before Sarah's voice returned. Sharp with the kind of fear that only comes when you realize that everything you thought was solid and permanent is actually built on sand. "What kind of mistake, Dad?" "I went to Las Vegas. I thought I could fix things, thought I could win back what we lost with the FDA rejection. I lost everything, Sarah, everything." Sarah Sterling had inherited her father's intelligence and her mother's emotional strength, but nothing could have prepared her for this moment. At 35, she was a respected researcher in her own right, with a PhD in biochemistry and a reputation for innovative drug development. She was also the mother of 12-year-old Emma, a child who had already shown signs of scientific brilliance that reminded everyone of her grandfather. "How much, Dad? How much did you lose?" $1 billion. The number hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Sarah sank into her kitchen chair, watching the sunrise paint the San Francisco skyline in shades of gold and orange, colors that now seemed mocking in their beauty. That's everything. The research funding, the operating capital, the emergency reserves. "Dad, you've just bankrupted us." I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Sarah. But apologies wouldn't save Sterling Pharmaceuticals now. As Richard flew back to San Francisco on what might be his last trip in the company jet, Sarah was already making the calls that no executive ever wants to make. The board meeting was scheduled for that afternoon, and she knew that by evening. The Sterling family's century-old legacy in pharmaceutical research would be over. The boardroom at Sterling Pharmaceuticals was a temple to success, its walls lined with awards and photographs documenting decades of medical breakthroughs. The long mahogany table had hosted countless meetings where decisions were made that affected millions of patients around the world. Today, it would host the company's funeral. Richard entered the room to find 12 faces staring at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright anger. These weren't just board members. They were old friends, longtime colleagues, people who had trusted him with their investments and their careers. "Richard," said James Morrison, the board's lead director and Richard's oldest friend, "please tell me the reports I've been hearing aren't true." Richard took his place at the head of the table, the same seat he had occupied for 25 years. His hands, which had once been steady enough to perform delicate laboratory procedures, now shook as he opened the folder containing the financial documents that spelled out the company's doom. "I'm afraid they are true, James. I made a catastrophic error in judgment, and, as a result, Sterling Pharmaceuticals no longer has the capital necessary to continue operations." The explosion of voices that followed was predictable but no less painful. Board members demanded explanations, threatened lawsuits, and spoke of the thousands of employees who would lose their jobs because of one man's reckless decision. Through it all, Richard sat in silence, accepting the verbal assault as a small portion of the punishment he knew he deserved. "The pharmaceutical patents alone are worth hundreds of millions," said Patricia Chen, the board's financial expert. "We can sell those to cover some of the debts." "And the research data," added another member. "The Alzheimer's drug may have been rejected by the FDA, but the underlying research is still valuable to other companies." Sarah, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "You're talking about dismantling everything. The patents, the research, the laboratories. That's not just intellectual property. That's my father's life work. That's our family's contribution to medical science." Sarah James said gently, "Sentiment doesn't pay creditors. We have a fiduciary duty to minimize losses however we can." As the board discussed the logistics of corporate liquidation, none of them noticed the small figure who had quietly entered the room and taken a seat in the corner. Emma Sterling, all of 12 years old and barely visible behind the massive leather chair, had been listening to every word. Emma was not an ordinary child. At an age when most kids were struggling with basic algebra, she was already working through calculus problems for fun. Her teachers called her gifted, her family called her their little genius. But more than her mathematical abilities, Emma possessed something even rarer. The kind of intuitive understanding of complex systems that allowed her to see solutions where others saw only problems. "Excuse me," Emma said, her young voice cutting through the heated discussion like a bell. "I think I might have an idea." The room fell silent. 12 adults turned to stare at the child who had just interrupted their corporate crisis management session. "Emma," Sarah said softly, "this isn't the time or place for Mum. Please, just listen for a minute." Emma stood up, her small frame dwarfed by the massive boardroom. But her voice carried the kind of confidence that reminded everyone exactly whose granddaughter she was. "I've been thinking about the Alzheimer's drug problem." Richard looked at his granddaughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Even in his darkest moment, Emma's brilliant mind was still working, still searching for solutions. "What about it, sweetheart?" Emma walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room and picked up a marker. Her handwriting was still that of a child, but the concepts she began to diagram were graduate-level biochemistry. The FDA rejected the drug because of the side effects in elderly patients, right? Specifically, the cardiac complications in people over 75. Patricia Chen nodded. "That's correct. The therapeutic benefits were significant, but the regulatory agency couldn't approve a drug that increased heart attack risk in the target demographic." Emma continued writing, her young mind organizing complex medical data with the precision of a seasoned researcher. "But what if we're thinking about this wrong? What if instead of treating Alzheimer's patients, we prevent Alzheimer's from developing in the first place?" The room was completely quiet now. Even the adults who had initially dismissed Emma's interruption were beginning to pay attention. "The research shows that the drug's mechanism of action actually works better in younger brain tissue," Emma continued. "Instead of waiting until someone develops symptoms, we could identify genetic markers for Alzheimer's risk and begin preventive treatment in people who are 50 or 60 years old. Their hearts are stronger, the side effects would be minimal, and we could potentially prevent the disease entirely." James Morrison leaned forward in his chair. "Emma, that's actually a fascinating approach. But the FDA would require entirely new clinical trials, which would cost $50 million, Emma said, turning back to face the board. "I calculated it, based on the research methodology you used for the original trials. Phase 1 trials for preventive treatment would involve younger, healthier subjects, so the safety profile would be much better." Sarah stared at her daughter in amazement. "Emma, how do you know all of this?" Emma shrugged, the gesture so purely childlike that it contrasted starkly with the sophistication of her analysis. I read Grandpa's research papers. They're really interesting, especially the biochemical pathways stuff. Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. His granddaughter had just outlined a strategy that could potentially save not only Sterling Pharmaceuticals, but also millions of people from developing Alzheimer's disease. And she had done it with the kind of clear thinking that had eluded a room full of experienced adults. It's brilliant, Patricia said slowly. Absolutely brilliant. But Emma, we still have the same problem. We don't have $50 million to fund new trials. Your grandfather lost. I know what he lost, Emma said, her young voice carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. But I also know something else, something I learned in my programming class at school. Emma walked back to the whiteboard and began drawing what looked like a simple flowchart. Sometimes, when you have a really big problem, the solution isn't to solve the big problem directly. Sometimes you solve a bunch of smaller problems, and they add up to solving the big one. She wrote 3 words on the board: licensing, partnerships, and innovation. We don't need $50 million all at once, Emma said. We need it spread out over 3 years, so we can license some of our existing patents to generate immediate cash flow. We can form partnerships with universities that have research budgets, and we can innovate our way out of debt by developing products that don't require massive clinical trials. James Morrison was now leaning forward, his business mind fully engaged. What kind of products? Emma smiled, and for a moment, the brilliant 12-year-old scientist was just a kid again. Diagnostic tools. Grandpa's research didn't just show how to treat Alzheimer's, it also identified biomarkers that predict who's going to develop it. We could create a genetic test that tells people their risk level 20 or 30 years before symptoms appear. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. A predictive test for Alzheimer's disease would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but more importantly, it would represent a genuine breakthrough in preventive medicine. Emma, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion, that's remarkable. But creating a diagnostic test still requires funding, regulatory approval, manufacturing capabilities. Not if we partner with companies that already have those things, Emma replied. There are laboratories all over the country that specialize in genetic testing. We provide the science, they provide the infrastructure, and we split the profits. It's like franchising, but for medical research. Sarah was now staring at her daughter with the kind of awe usually reserved for witnessing miracles. Emma, where did you learn about business partnerships and franchising? Emma grinned. I watch a lot of business shows with Dad while Mom's working late. Plus, I read Forbes sometimes. It's not that different from science. You just have to understand how systems work and figure out how to make them more efficient. The room erupted in discussion as board members began to see the possibilities that Emma's young mind had laid out. The girl had taken their impossible situation and transformed it into a roadmap for not just survival, but unprecedented success. Over the following weeks, Emma's ideas began to take shape in ways that amazed everyone involved. Working with her mother and grandfather, she helped design a comprehensive strategy that addressed every aspect of Sterling Pharmaceuticals' crisis. The licensing agreements came first. Patents for 3 of the company's older medications were licensed to generic drug manufacturers, providing immediate cash flow of $15 million. It wasn't enough to solve their problems, but it bought them time. Next came the university partnerships. Emma had identified 17 research institutions with Alzheimer's programs that were eager to collaborate on preventive treatment studies. By sharing research costs and data, Sterling Pharmaceuticals could conduct its new clinical trials for a fraction of the original estimate. But it was the diagnostic test that truly captured everyone's imagination. Working with a genetic testing company in Boston, Sarah and Emma developed a comprehensive screening tool that could predict Alzheimer's risk with remarkable accuracy. The test examined 47 different genetic markers and provided individuals with a detailed risk assessment that could guide preventive lifestyle changes and medical monitoring. 6 months after Richard Sterling's catastrophic night in Las Vegas, the first Sterling Predict Alzheimer's diagnostic kits rolled off the production line. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Families with histories of dementia lined up to understand their risk profiles, and healthcare providers embraced a tool that finally allowed them to take proactive approaches to cognitive health. Within a year, Sterling Pharmaceuticals had not only recovered from its near bankruptcy, but had become the leader in predictive Alzheimer's diagnostics. The company's stock price soared to levels that exceeded its pre-crisis highs, and the new preventive treatment drug was showing such promising results in clinical trials that the FDA had designated it for expedited review. But perhaps the most significant change was in Richard Sterling himself. The man who had nearly destroyed his family's legacy had learned a profound lesson about the difference between gambling and calculated risk. More importantly, he had discovered that the greatest asset his family possessed wasn't money or patents or research facilities. It was the brilliant minds and loving hearts of the people who carried the Sterling name. On a warm evening in San Francisco, exactly 1 year after his devastating night in Las Vegas, Richard Sterling sat in his office reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Sterling Pharmaceuticals' remarkable recovery. The numbers were impressive, but they weren't what made him smile. What made him smile was the small desk in the corner of his office, where Emma now spent her afternoons after school, working on her own research projects while her grandfather and mother conducted their daily business. The 12-year-old who had saved their family company was now 13, and her ideas were already shaping the future of medical research in ways that would benefit generations to come. Grandpa, Emma said, looking up from her notebook where she was sketching molecular structures. "I've been thinking about cancer research." Richard chuckled. "Of course you have. What about it?" "Well, if early detection worked so well for Alzheimer's prediction, maybe we could apply the same principles to other diseases. I've been reading about tumor suppressor genes, and I think there might be a way to identify cancer risks decades before symptoms appear." Sarah, who was reviewing clinical trial data at the main conference table, looked up with the expression of a mother who had learned to never underestimate her daughter's insights. "Emma, that's exactly what researchers at Johns Hopkins have been working on. It's incredibly complex." Emma nodded seriously. "I know, that's what makes it interesting." As Richard watched his granddaughter return to her sketches, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. His night of devastating losses at the Bellagio had taught him that sometimes the greatest disasters can become the catalysts for the greatest triumphs, but only if we're willing to listen to the unexpected voices of wisdom that surround us. Maria Santos, the blackjack dealer who had witnessed Richard's downfall, received a letter a few months later. Along with a check for $1 million, a bonus that would allow her to retire and pursue her dream of opening a small restaurant, was a note that simply read, "Thank you for your kindness on my darkest night. Your compassion reminded me of what truly matters." R. Sterling. Maria kept the letter framed on her restaurant wall, along with a newspaper clipping about Sterling Pharmaceuticals' revolutionary Alzheimer's research. Customers often asked about the connection between a casino dealer and a pharmaceutical breakthrough, and Maria would smile and tell them about the night when she watched a man lose everything, and how that loss became the foundation for saving countless lives. The story of Richard Sterling's billion-dollar loss and his granddaughter's brilliant salvation became legendary in both the business and medical communities. Harvard Business School created a case study about the importance of family involvement in crisis management. Medical journals published papers about the innovative approaches to preventive spit medicine that emerged from Sterling Pharmaceuticals' near collapse. But for the Sterling family, the most important lesson wasn't about business strategy or medical innovation. It was about the profound truth that sometimes our greatest strengths are revealed only in our moments of deepest vulnerability, and that wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources. Emma Sterling continued to work alongside her grandfather and mother throughout her teenage years, contributing to research projects that revolutionized the field of predictive medicine. By the time she graduated from high school at 16, she had already co-authored 5 peer-reviewed papers and held 3 medical patents. She chose to attend MIT for her undergraduate studies, majoring in both biochemistry and business administration. Her senior thesis, titled "The Economics of Preventive Medicine: How Early Detection Technologies Can Transform Healthcare Costs," was published in the New England Journal of Medicine and became required reading at medical schools across the country. Richard Sterling lived to see his granddaughter graduate, summa cum laude, begin her PhD studies in molecular biology. On his 75th birthday, surrounded by family and colleagues at a celebration honoring Sterling Pharmaceuticals' transformation from near bankruptcy to industry leadership, he made a speech that would be remembered long after he was gone. 20 years ago, I made the worst decision of my life, he said, his voice strong despite his years. I gambled with my family's future, and I lost everything that I thought mattered. But in losing everything, I discovered something infinitely more valuable: the incredible power of human resilience, creativity, and love. He looked at Emma, now 22, and already recognized as one of the brightest minds in medical research. My granddaughter taught me that problems are just opportunities wearing disguises. She showed me that age is no barrier to wisdom, and that the smallest voices often carry the most important messages. Richard Sterling passed away peacefully 2 years later, at the age of 67. His funeral was attended by thousands of people whose lives had been touched by Sterling Pharmaceuticals' medical breakthroughs. But the most moving tribute came from Maria Santos, the former blackjack dealer whose restaurant had become a gathering place for Las Vegas workers seeking honest food and genuine kindness. He lost $1 billion at my table, she told the assembled mourners, but he found something worth infinitely more. He found the courage to trust in tomorrow, and he found a way to turn his greatest failure into his family's greatest triumph. Emma Sterling, now Dr. Emma Sterling, and the youngest person ever appointed to Sterling Pharmaceuticals' board of directors, stood at her grandfather's grave as the sun set over the San Francisco hills. In her hands, she held the research proposal that would define the next phase of her career: a comprehensive study of genetic markers for 12 different diseases, based on the predictive medicine model that had saved her family's company. "I promise I'll make you proud, Grandpa," she whispered to the quiet evening air. "And I promise I'll never forget that sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards, but only when we take them with love, wisdom, and the people who matter most." As she walked back toward her car, Emma reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her family from the brink of destruction to the forefront of medical innovation. Her grandfather's devastating night at the Bellagio had taught them all that fortune could disappear in an instant, but that the bonds between family members, strengthened by trust and tested by adversity, could overcome any challenge. The Sterling Pharmaceutical building glowed in the distance, its lights representing not just a successful business, but a symbol of human resilience and the power of brilliant minds working together toward a common goal. Inside those laboratories, researchers were working on treatments that would prevent suffering for millions of people around the world. And it had all started with a 12-year-old girl who refused to accept that problems were permanent, who looked at her family's greatest crisis and saw instead their greatest opportunity. Sometimes, the smallest voices carry the biggest solutions. Sometimes, losing everything is the first step toward finding what truly matters. And sometimes, the courage to bet on hope when all seems lost is the only gamble that really pays off. In the end, Richard Sterling's billion-dollar loss at the Bellagio wasn't just a cautionary tale about the dangers of gambling. It was a testament to the incredible power of family, the unexpected wisdom of youth, and the remarkable truth that our greatest failures often become the foundations for our most extraordinary triumphs. Trust, patience, and strategy can turn despair into triumph. But sometimes, it takes the clear eyes of a child to show us the path forward. The years that followed Emma's breakthrough continued to unfold like chapters in an extraordinary tale of redemption and innovation. Sterling Pharmaceuticals didn't just recover, it revolutionized the entire approach to preventive medicine, setting new standards that transformed healthcare worldwide. Dr. Emma Sterling's diagnostic innovations expanded far beyond Alzheimer's prediction. By the time she turned 25, her research team had developed predictive tests for 17 different conditions, including various forms of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, and rare genetic disorders. The Sterling Predictive Health Initiative became the gold standard for early detection medicine, saving millions of lives and billions of dollars in healthcare costs. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Sterling family's journey was how it changed their perspective on risk, reward, and what truly constitutes wealth. Richard's catastrophic gambling loss had taught them that financial security, no matter how vast, could vanish in a single night. However, the intellectual capital, family bonds, and innovative thinking that saved their company proved to be assets that grew stronger under pressure. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Sarah Sterling, who had once focused solely on research, discovered a passion for mentoring young scientists. Under her guidance, Sterling Pharmaceuticals became known not just for breakthrough medications, but for developing the next generation of medical innovators. The company's internship program attracted the brightest minds from universities around the world, many of them drawn by the story of a 12-year-old girl who had saved her family's legacy. Science isn't just about discovering new things, Sarah would tell each new group of interns. It's about solving problems that matter to real people. Every equation you write, every hypothesis you test, every experiment you conduct has the potential to change someone's life for the better. The Sterling Foundation, established with profits from the diagnostic testing revolution, became one of the world's largest funders of preventive medicine research. Emma insisted that 20% of all foundation grants go to projects led by researchers under 30 years old, believing that fresh perspectives were essential for breakthrough thinking. One of those young researchers was Dr. Marcus Chen, a 28-year-old neuroscientist whose grandmother had died from Alzheimer's disease just months before the Sterling diagnostic test became available. His proposal for a non-invasive brain imaging technique that could detect cognitive changes 30 years before symptoms appeared caught Emma's attention during a foundation review meeting. "The technology exists," Marcus explained to the review board, his voice carrying the same passionate intensity that had once driven Richard Sterling's pharmaceutical ambitions. "We just need to combine machine learning algorithms with advanced MRI techniques. The brain shows microscopic changes decades before memory problems begin. If we can identify those patterns, we can intervene before any damage becomes permanent." Emma, now 30 and serving as the Foundation's youngest ever board member, saw something familiar in Marcus's eyes, the same burning desire to solve impossible problems that had driven her grandfather's career and her own. Childhood fascination with medical research. "How much funding do you need?" she asked. $12 million over 3 years, Marcus replied, expecting the same polite rejections he had received from other funding agencies. "Approved," Emma said without hesitation. "But I have one condition. I want to work directly on this project, not as a board member providing oversight, but as a researcher contributing to the actual science." The collaboration between Emma and Marcus led to one of the most significant breakthroughs in neuroscience history. Their brain imaging technique, dubbed the Sterling-Chun Cognitive Assessment, could predict Alzheimer's development with 97% accuracy, 35 years before traditional symptoms appeared. More importantly, it could identify the specific brain regions where preventive treatments would be most effective. The announcement of their breakthrough made international headlines. But for Emma, the most meaningful moment came in a quiet hospital room in Boston, where she demonstrated the new technology for its first real-world patient. Mrs. Dorothy Jameson, 73 years old, had volunteered for the study because her mother had died from Alzheimer's disease. The scan took only 20 minutes, painless and non-invasive, but the results would change her life forever. "Mrs. Jameson," Emma said gently, sitting beside the worried woman's bed, "your scan shows no signs of the brain changes associated with Alzheimer's development. Based on your genetic profile and brain imaging, your risk of developing the disease is less than 5%. Dorothy began to cry tears of relief that carried decades of fear and anxiety. "I've been terrified for 20 years, she whispered. "Every time I forgot where I put my keys, every time I couldn't remember someone's name, I thought it was starting." Emma held the elderly woman's hand, understanding that this moment represented the true value of her family's work. It wasn't about the billions of dollars in revenue, or the scientific accolades, or the patents that would secure their financial future for generations. It was about giving people, like Dorothy Jameson, the gift of knowing that they could age without fear. The success of the Sterling-Chun technique attracted attention from medical centers around the world. But it also brought unexpected challenges. Insurance companies struggled to determine how to cover predictive tests for diseases that might never develop. Ethical committees debated whether people had a right not to know their genetic futures. Pharmaceutical companies scrambled to develop new preventive treatments for conditions that could now be predicted decades in advance. Emma found herself at the center of these debates, testifying before Congress about the implications of predictive medicine and working with international health organizations to establish ethical guidelines for genetic testing. At 32, she was named to Time magazine's list of the world's most influential people. But she wore the recognition lightly. "Influence is just responsibility in a fancy dress," she told the reporter who interviewed her for the cover story. "The only thing that matters is whether we're using our knowledge to reduce suffering and improve lives." The Sterling family's influence extended far beyond medicine. Their story became a case study taught in business schools, psychology programs, and family therapy courses. The transformation of a gambling addiction's devastating consequences into a multi-billion-dollar healthcare revolution illustrated principles that applied to recovery, innovation, and resilience in countless different contexts. James Morrison, Richard's old friend who had served on the Sterling Pharmaceuticals board during its darkest hour, often spoke at conferences about the night when a 12-year-old girl had saved their company. Now, in his 80s and retired from business, he had become an advocate for including diverse voices in corporate decision-making. "We almost made the classic mistake of assuming that wisdom comes only with age and experience," he would tell audiences of executives and entrepreneurs. Emma Sterling taught us that fresh perspectives, unencumbered by conventional thinking, can see solutions that escape even the most experienced minds. The impact of Emma's early insights continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. Her emphasis on university partnerships had created a new model for pharmaceutical research, where academic institutions and private companies shared both costs and discoveries. This collaborative approach accelerated medical innovation while reducing the financial risks that had once driven companies like Sterling Pharmaceuticals toward desperate gambles. The diagnostic testing revolution that began with Alzheimer's prediction expanded into a comprehensive approach to personalized medicine. By the time Emma turned 35, it was routine for people to receive detailed genetic profiles that predicted their risks for dozens of different conditions, along with personalized prevention strategies that could add decades to their healthy lifespans. Maria Santos, the former blackjack dealer whose kindness had provided a moment of human connection during Richard Sterling's darkest hour, lived to see the full flowering of the medical revolution that had grown from that terrible night. Her small restaurant in Las Vegas had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by business students and medical researchers who wanted to understand how momentary human connections could change the course of history. "I just did what felt right," Maria would tell her visitors. Now, in her 70s and still cooking with the same care that had characterized her years dealing cards, when you see someone destroying themselves, you try to remind them of their humanity. "I had no idea it would lead to anything like this." The restaurant's walls were covered with letters from Alzheimer's families around the world, thanking Maria for the small act of compassion that had ultimately saved their loved ones. She kept Richard Sterling's original letter in a place of honor, along with photographs from Emma's wedding and the birth of her children. Emma married Marcus Chen in a ceremony held at Sterling Pharmaceuticals headquarters, surrounded by the research laboratories where their love story had begun, with a shared passion for solving impossible problems. Their wedding cake was decorated with molecular diagrams of the compounds they had discovered together, a detail that perfectly captured their unique romance. Their 3 children grew up in an environment where scientific curiosity was as natural as breathing. The Sterling Chun household featured microscopes alongside toy boxes, and bedtime stories often involved tales of medical discoveries and the scientists who had changed the world through persistence and creativity. Emma's eldest daughter, Sophie, showed an early aptitude for mathematics that reminded everyone of her mother's childhood brilliance. At 8 years old, she was already designing computer programs to analyze genetic data, carrying forward the family tradition of finding technological solutions to medical challenges. The Sterling Pharmaceuticals campus had grown into a sprawling complex that included research laboratories, manufacturing facilities, and an educational center where high school students could participate in real medical research projects. The Richard Sterling Memorial Library housed one of the world's largest collections of genetic research data, freely available to scientists around the globe. But perhaps the most meaningful addition to the campus was the small memorial garden dedicated to all the families affected by Alzheimer's disease. At its center stood a simple bronze plaque with words that Emma had chosen to honor her grandfather's memory. From our greatest failures can grow our most extraordinary triumphs, but only when we face them with love, courage, and hope for tomorrow. The garden had become a place of pilgrimage for families dealing with dementia. A quiet space where people could find comfort in knowing that their suffering had contributed to breakthroughs that would spare future generations from similar pain. Emma often found herself walking through the garden in the evenings, reflecting on the incredible journey that had begun with her grandfather's devastating night of gambling, and led to medical innovations that were changing the world. The Sterling story continued to evolve as each new generation built upon the foundations laid by their predecessors. Emma's research into predictive medicine opened doorways to entirely new fields of study. Her son Michael, named after his great-uncle, showed early signs of brilliance in biochemical engineering, already designing new drug delivery systems at age 12 that could target specific cells with unprecedented precision. The family's influence extended into areas that Richard Sterling could never have imagined when he first established his pharmaceutical company. The Sterling Institute for Predictive Medicine became a global leader in training the next generation of medical researchers. The Sterling Chun Foundation funded research projects in over 40 countries, with a particular focus on developing low-cost diagnostic tools for underserved populations. Emma's work on accessible healthcare technology led to the development of smartphone-based diagnostic apps that could perform basic genetic screening, using only a saliva sample and a device that cost less than $50. These tools brought predictive medicine to remote communities around the world, democratizing access to healthcare information that had once been available only to the wealthy. The transformation of Sterling Pharmaceuticals from a near-bankrupt company to a global healthcare leader became a symbol of American innovation and resilience. Presidents and prime ministers visited the Sterling campus, seeking to understand how a family's darkest moment had become the catalyst for one of the most significant medical revolutions in human history. But Emma never forgot the lessons of her grandfather's gambling addiction and the fragility of even the most successful enterprises. Sterling Pharmaceuticals maintained conservative financial practices, never risking more than the company could afford to lose, and always keeping the focus on patients rather than profits. Money is just a tool, Emma would tell new employees during orientation sessions. It's what we build with that tool that defines our legacy. Every dollar we spend, every decision we make, every research project we fund should ultimately serve one purpose: reducing human suffering and improving lives. The Sterling approach to business became a model studied in business schools around the world. Their emphasis on long-term thinking over short-term profits, their commitment to ethical research practices, and their belief in the power of diverse perspectives to drive innovation influenced countless other companies and organizations. As Emma approached her 40th birthday, she reflected on the extraordinary arc of her family's story. Her grandfather's billion-dollar loss at the Bellagio, which had once seemed like the end of everything they had built, had actually been the beginning of their greatest chapter. The pain and fear of that crisis had forced them to discover strengths they didn't know they possessed, and to find solutions they never would have considered in more comfortable circumstances. The Sterling name, which had once been associated with pharmaceutical innovation, was now synonymous with predictive medicine, ethical business practices, and the power of family bonds to overcome any challenge. But more than any professional achievement, Emma treasured the knowledge that her work had given millions of families something that had seemed impossible. Just a few decades earlier, the ability to face the future without fear, armed with knowledge that could prevent suffering before it began. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the importance of family and the power of never giving up, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything seemed lost, only to discover that you were actually on the verge of your greatest breakthrough. Your stories of resilience and hope inspire us all to keep believing that tomorrow can be better than today.